In Isaiah chapter 28 this evening, Isaiah chapter 28. We have a prophecy that begins talking about the 10 tribes of Israel, as it refers to them as Ephraim, and what is going to take place with them. But the focus isn't Ephraim, the focus is actually Judah. The first 4 verses talk about the 10 tribes of Israel and what's going to happen with them. Then it immediately makes a change to talking about Judah, and it starts off with the response that they have as being one that is very prideful, arrogant in a way. And then it goes into the Lord talking about all of their problems and the sins that are going on with them, and they're consumed in the sin, and actually talks to them as being consumed or swallowed up in wine, talking about the evilness that was there, the drunkenness that was upon them, and they even in their sin Lord actually calls out and talks about a solution that they had to protect themselves from trouble that they had done, and the Lord condemns them for that as well, in seeking to do their own thing for their own protection instead of seeking the Lord. And that the Lord actually comes out and tells them, He says, and it's not going to be able to protect you. You should have chosen me. You should have trusted in me. They should have followed Him. And then he kind of closes out the prophecy, or this chapter closes out with an example that is given to us using a farmer to explain God's actions, why He's doing it. Not really to explain it, but just to show what is taking place, I guess we could say. So let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, and we'll dive right in. Lord, I'm so thankful for this opportunity we have yet again to be here and to be able to gather together in Your Word, to just be assembled together as a body, Lord, to learn more about You, to learn Your will for us in our lives. I ask that You would open up our hearts and our minds to Your Word now. Help us to be focused on it, focused on the message of it, Lord, that we would hear it and we would allow it to be applied to our lives and we'd take action upon it. I pray that You would guide and direct me as I share Your Word, but that ultimately everything will be for Your honor, Your glory, and Your will. In Jesus' name, amen. And he starts it off first here. We're talking about Judah's false glory, but the first thing we have is the condemnation upon Ephraim. If we look at verse 1, he says, "Woe to the crown of pride, to the drunkards of Ephraim, whose glorious beauty is a fading flower, which are the head of the fat valleys of them that are overcome with wine. Behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one, which is a tempest of hail, and a destroying storm, as a flood of mighty waters overflowing, shall cast down to the earth with the hand. The crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim, shall be trodden under feet, and the glorious beauty which is on the head of the fat of the valley, or the head of the fat valley, shall be a fading flower, and as the hasty fruit before the summer, which when he that looketh upon it seeth, while it is yet in his hand, he eateth it up." So what we have here is talking, and it begins talking about the crown of pride to the drunkards of Ephraim. And we've seen, as we've been going through the prophets, we've seen this term used a lot, talking about Ephraim, and it's talking about the northern tribe, the 10 tribes of Israel. And then during this time as well, we have Judah, and Judah is the focus of this, but it talks about here first with Ephraim, and it describes them, the first thing here in the first verse, it describes them as being very proudful, and drunkards as well, and he even describes them here, he says, whose glorious beauty is a fading flower. The beauty that they once were, the wonderful nation that they once were, is fading away. There's no longer beauty in them. It's almost gone. Now, the question is, what caused their beauty? The Lord. Everything that was wonderful about Israel was all due to their following the Lord. Their most prosperous times came while having good kings, kings that followed the Lord. And he tells them, he says, because of your arrogance and your drunkenness and your sin that is going on here, your beauty is fading. It's almost gone. You know, he even describes here of this fading flower, he says, which are on the head of the fat valleys of them that are overcome with wine. As well here, Israel was set up in a way to be able to prosper, was set up in the land of milk and honey so that they could prosper, so that they could be fruitful, so that they could be plentiful. But even of the most nutritious of place, the best place to be, it is all ruined because they are overcome with their wine, or overcome with their drunkenness. It has ruined them. And he says in verse 2, he says, behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one. He says, which as a tempest of hail and a destroying storm as a flood of mighty waters overflowing shall cast down to the earth with the hand. The Lord now tells him, he says, and I've prepared one. I've prepared a mighty and strong one. Speaking of the Assyrians that would come and overcome them. And he describes them as being like a tempest, a strong storm of hail and of destroying storm, as a flood of mighty waters overflowing. He's describing a very intense flood here. Hail is very destructive to a land, and the flood kind of sticks around and it makes its way into every nook and cranny. It just destroys everything. And he's describing this as a very intense, a very damaging storm that's going to come, but one that is all-encompassing as well. And this is what happens. The Assyrians come in, they destroy, they kill, and they do it very quickly, very efficiently, and you just go all the way across the 10 tribes of Israel. And he says here in verse 3, he says, the crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim, shall be trodden under feet. He says, and they will be trodden down, broken apart, smashed into the ground. Be done. The Lord's going to humble them. And he describes this here again. He says in verse 4, he says, and the glorious beauty which is on the head of the fat valley shall be a fading flower. And so he mentions again their beauty that is fading away, that's going to go away. And he describes here how quickly the rest of it's going to go, because he says, and as the hasty fruit or early fruit before the summer, which when he that looketh upon it seeth, while it is yet in his hand, he eateth it up. He describes here the first fruits of the tree coming, the first one coming, and the person that sees it desires it. It's the first one, and they're hungry, and they go and they take it and they consume it instantly. They don't even bother with storing it for a while or taking it into the barn, putting it up for a while. They just immediately, right then and there in their hand, they eat it. And this is what he describes. He says, this is how quickly it's going to happen. What little of your beauty is left is just going to be snatched up and consumed. Gone. Now, in verse 5, he begins describing Judah's response to this, and his turns directly to them. Now we know this to be Judah, because in verse 14 it mentions Jerusalem, and then in verse 16 he mentions Zion. But in verse 5 it says, in that day shall the Lord of hosts be for a crown of glory, and for a diadem of beauty unto the residue of his people. Now, normally when we see a verse like this where it's talking about a group of people after a destruction, Oftentimes they're more commonly referred to as the remnant. Here he describes them as being the residue, but normally when we see this terminology, when we see a group of people that's left over, it's talking about people that are following the Lord. You're talking about people that never stopped following Him. But I want you to look here at verse 7, and then we'll back up and talk about these. But in verse 7 it says, but they, referring back to verse 5 and 6, they also have erred through wine and through strong drink and are out of the way. The priest and the prophet have erred through strong drink. They are swallowed up with wine. They are all out of the way through strong drink. They err in vision. They stumble in judgment. This doesn't describe a people that is following the Lord. This doesn't describe a people that are worshiping Him, that have stuck with Him. This describes another group of people that are just as deep in their sin. And so let's go ahead and back up, and then we'll come back to this in time. But in verse 5, we see here it says, in that day shall the Lord of hosts be for a crown of glory, for a diadem of beauty unto the residue of His people. And so what takes place here is that once Israel is overcome and Judah, and when the Assyrians come, they do quite a bit of damage in Judah, but they're spared. But what happens is when they come and they overcome it, it says that they have the Lord of hosts becomes a crown of glory to them. Now, this isn't a crown of glory of worship, of true, honest love for the Lord and a desire for His will to be done. This is they got what they deserved. We survived. They got it. This is a very arrogant pride that came out of them. Desire of thinking to be better. And for Judah too, they did have some good kings after this point. You had Hezekiah and you have Josiah, who were very good kings. But Judah was still very much so an evil nation that was just a little bit behind Israel. God spared them, and He punished them and tried to turn them back, but they didn't learn their lesson. They still walked evil. It says in 6, and for a spirit of judgment to him that sitteth in judgment, for the strength to them that turn the battle to the gate. And he describes here their arrogance, thinking, it's so great that this has happened to Israel, that they've gotten what they've got, but really they're in judgment as well. The Lord is still upset with them as well. And so he gets into this starting in verse 7, talking about the problems that he has with them. And he describes pretty much the same problem that Ephraim has, drunkenness. Because he says in 7, but they also have erred through wine and through strong drink, are out of the way. They're consumed with their drunkenness, and it has taken them out of the way of the Lord. It has taken them down the wrong path as well. They're in the same path, just a few steps behind. But describes even, it says that the priest and the prophet have erred through strong drink. Now, normally when you talk about a priest and you talk about a prophet, you think these are men of God. Now, Isaiah is a prophet of God during this time, and he wasn't consumed with this stuff. We're talking about false priests and false prophets. Okay? And he says they even have been consumed by this. These men that should have been leading people to walk in the Lord, they're walking so much in sin, and here it describes them. They've erred through strong drink, and they are swallowed up of wine. Yeah, I find it interesting that he describes it here as the wine having swallowed them up. But really, it's a pretty good description of what happens with drunkenness, is it not? You start off consuming the wine, but eventually it gets to the point where it's consuming you. It's controlling you. Or you have little control, however you want to describe it. You become swallowed up in it. He says, and this is what happens. And I think as well here, when he talks about the wine, he's talking about the sin as well. I think they were drunk too. And he says they are out of the way through strong drink. They err in vision. They stumble in judgment. What it's caused them to do, what's happened, is just like anybody else that's drunk. They can't see clearly and they can't make good decisions. Now, God's not talking about their ability to ride a horse, because they didn't have cars then. He's talking about things of more importance. Their moral compass. They can't see where to go, what to do, what the right path is for them to walk on in their life. We're not talking about just how can they get home and not being able to see. We're talking about their entire lives, that they just have no vision of what is right and what is wrong. And this, it even talks here that they stumble in judgment. They can't make what is a decision as to what was good and what was bad. It's because they've been swallowed up. And look here in verse 8, it says, "For all tables are full of vomit and filthiness, so that there is no place clean." We are not just talking about a small percentage. We are not talking about people that are just getting started in their drunkenness. What happens when you get super drunk? You vomit. He's describing a people here that are so consumed in this that every table is covered in vomit. There is no place that is clean. We are talking about the entire nation. There's a problem with this. That there's nowhere he can find to be clean. Now, I have no doubt there are a few in Judah that are still following the Lord, but the nation as a whole is consumed in this. Their sin is so disgusting to God. There's so much of it. There's no place that is untouched by it. Now it describes their rejection of the truth. In verse 9 it says, "Whom shall he teach knowledge? Whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breasts." They're so consumed in their sin, it is so destructive that there's this question that's being asked here of who can be taught the knowledge, who can be made to understand the doctrine. There's none that are teachable in God's Word, in God's commandments. And he's going to talk about it some more. But I says, really his only option is to go to those that have just been weaned from their mothers, have just been taken off the breast. That he would have more success trying to teach a young child barely off of his mother than to teach anybody else in the nation. Now, you can teach a young child a few things, but not very well, not very efficiently. And he continues in 10. It says, "For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little. With stammering lips and another tongue will he speak to this people, to whom he said, This is the rest wherewith ye may cause the weary to rest. This is the refreshing, yet they would not hear." He's continually talking about this, and he's kind of describing it in the most basic parts of it, in the precept upon precept, starting at the beginning, trying to teach this through, trying to get it through their thick skull, all these things that matter. And he says, what I'm going to do now is we're going to teach it. He says, with stammering lips and another tongue. And when we think of stammering lips, we think of somebody that stutters, that's unable to speak. The Lord knows what he's going to say. What he's talking about here is something that it's harder for them to understand. It's not going to be quite as easy for it to come to them. And it kind of describes this as well, and he says, and in another tongue will he speak to this people. And what he's doing is he's saying, I've brought it to you in an easy way before. I brought it to you through the prophets. I brought it through you through my word, for you to read, for you to understand, for it to be taught to you, and for you to just accept it. But that's not good enough anymore. You're not listening to me. You're not changing things. You're ignoring this. So since you won't hear me the easy way, now I'm going to bring it to you the hard way. And he's doing this. He's telling them the hard way is that he's going to bring punishment upon them. He's going to bring the rod. God would much rather us learn things the easy way. But sometimes we won't listen to it the easy way. So he has to teach it to us the hard way. Through chastisement. A good parent, teaches the child, tries to tell them, don't do this. But when the child doesn't listen, sometimes you need a heavy hand to remind them. But they never desire to be a good parent. He says, there was the easy way, now we're doing the hard way. He even describes, he says, to whom he said, this is the rest wherewith ye may cause the weary to rest. This is the refreshing, yet they would not hear. He describes it here, he says, whenever I taught you before, I said, this, if you do these things, it'll be rest. It'll be easy for you. It'll be good for you. What is God, especially when you look at Israel early, or you look specifically whenever they wanted a king, whenever they called for the king, the Lord said, it doesn't matter what kind of king you have. I'm going to give you the king you want. But it doesn't matter what king you have. Because ultimately, I'm your king. If you follow me, I will bless you. Things will be good. Things will be plentiful. You'll be a strong nation. But if you reject me, things will be different. He gives us His word. And when we follow it, it is refreshing. It is a rest for us, an encouragement, a joy. But when we reject it, that is not the case. That is not the way it is. They had the easy way, the prosperous way. That's gone. Now we see the Lord places a choice before them. He talks about a choice that they've already put in place, that they've already started doing, but another choice that they have. And he's going to talk about the result of the wrong choice. We look in verse 14, he says, wherefore, hear the word of the Lord, ye scornful men that rule this people which is in Jerusalem. He calls out the leaders of Judah. He says, now, take heed. Listen to me. And he's talking to all of Judah. He's saying, listen to me now. Look at your brothers, Israel, and what happened to them. Listen to me now. You're going down the wrong path. Now is your chance. And he calls out a problem or a decision that they made. He says in verse 15, because ye have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with hell are we in agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us, for we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. They have here what could be best described as a false hope. When we look back, we see that Judah actually makes a pact or starts paying the Assyrians to protect them. And they think, oh, we're paying off the Assyrians and they're strong. They can protect us. They can save us. Nothing can come up against us. And this is what God is telling you back here. He's saying you've made a pact with death, saying that we paid off death, basically, so that they can't do anything to us, so that it won't do anything to us. And that fails miserably. And the Lord tells them it's going to fail miserably. They basically say, even though all these problems are happening with everybody else, even though it happened to Israel, it's not going to happen to us because we paid off death. In verse 16, the Lord gives them another option that they should take, but they don't. He says in verse 16, therefore, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. He that believeth shall not make haste. We're telling them, really, you need to be trusting in me, because I am the one that Jerusalem is built on. I am the cornerstone. I am the strength of your nation. You are not the strength. The decisions that you make are not the strength. You are not the one that has designed all this. I am. If you believe on me, if you trust in me, you have nothing to worry about. You won't need to run. You won't need to fear anything because I will be strong. Now, when we go to the New Testament, Christ is compared as being, or described as being, the chief cornerstone. That everything is built from Him, everything is established on Him. You know, and I think this is a really good description here for us because, you know, there are so many trusts in their own ways to cheat death or to save themselves. They trust in this and they trust in that they've done, that they think that somehow they can do enough good things to where they can pay off God. That they've made a deal with God. If I do this, then you'll do that. Some think that they have a certain status, so they're good. Couldn't be farther from the truth. There's nothing we can do to buy off death. There's nothing we can do to fend it off. There's no deal you can make. There's no alliance that you can make. There's no amount of money or works that you can accomplish to pay it off. The only solution is Christ. Just as Judah could not save themselves, we cannot save ourselves. Only Christ can. Only God could save them. The Lord places a judgment before them. They do not trust in the Lord to save them. So in verse 17 it says, judgment also will I lay to the lime, and righteousness to the plummet. And the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the water shall overflow the hiding place. Sounds a bit familiar to what takes place with Israel. But here we have a storm that's being sent upon Judah. And he says, I'm going to judge you, or he basically is saying he's going to lay a line. And when you lay a line, what are you trying to do? You're trying to find the straight edge. And when he talks about the plummet, we're talking about plumb. So we have level this way and straight, and then we have plumb up and down. Making sure everything's straight and level. This is what he's doing. He's saying, you guys think these things about you? You think that you're this, and you think you're that, and you think that everything's okay? Well, I'm going to put the measuring rod up next to you. We're going to put the level on the side of your nation, and we're going to see whether or not you are as straight as you say you are. And then what's going to happen is it's going to point out exactly how crooked you are. Now, sometimes when you look at something with your eye, you look at it and you go, oh, that's pretty straight. And then you put a straight edge along it. It's like, oh, maybe not so much. Now, when doing carpentry work, finished carpentry work, you always find all the things that the rough framer messed up. And with the drywall put on and it made smooth and painted over, it looks nice and smooth and straight and plumb. But then you go to throw the door in, and the opening is all kinds of crooked. And then you go put the baseboard on and you look down the side and the wall just has a wave to it. Go to measure this, and you check here, and you check here, you check here, and it's all different. When just looking at it, it looks like it's all straight, it looks like it's all great. You know, sometimes in our lives, when we look at our lives and we think, oh, things are pretty good, things are pretty great, but then the Lord slaps the measuring stick up next to us, the Lord slaps the level up next to us, the straight edge, and it points out all the areas that were crooked and off. That's why we can't compare ourselves to other people, even if we think they're straight. Chances are guaranteed that they're not as straight as we think they are. And if you've ever used something that's crooked to make a straight edge, it comes out crooked too, but it has a little bit of its own discrepancies off of the other one. You use that one to make another one, and you repeat the process. Before long, you're going to have a U on your hands. So what happens is we compare ourselves to somebody else thinking they're straight, and they're not really straight. They're a little bit crooked, and we end up changing that a little bit too and become a little bit more crooked, and then somebody else follows that, and then somebody else follows that, and you don't realize it, but that person that you compared yourself had compared themselves to a few different people along the lines, and there's nothing straight about any of you. Judah had compared themselves to Israel and thought themselves straight. But the Lord's going to send the hail. It's going to sweep away the refuge of lies. It's going to pound all those. It's going to put holes in all their stories and all their lies. And the waters are going to overflow the hiding places, all the places where they've hidden things. They've hidden that. They've hidden this. The water's going to come in, and they're going to seep into every single corner. We all know how. Whenever a flood comes, what areas are left untouched by those waters that were underneath those waters? Nothing. It just seeps into every bitty corner. Some of you have experienced floods in your basement, and you know that when that happens, you got to cut everything off at the bottom to get it to dry out because water gets inside the walls. You think everything inside those walls is tight and hidden away, but the water finds its way in. He continues to describe this, and in verse 19 he says, verse 18. He says, "And your covenant with death shall be disannulled, and your agreement with hell shall not stand. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, then ye shall be trodden down by it." Their alliance that they thought they had that was going to protect them from death, it's going to protect them from all. He says, whenever I come, that's done. You're going to see that it doesn't actually matter. It doesn't actually stand for anything, which is what happens. The alliance does them no good. He says, and yours is going to be trodden down, just the same as Israel. Verse 19, he says, from the time that it goeth forth, it shall take you for morning by morning, shall it pass over day by night, and by night, and it shall be a vexation only to understand the report. And he says, in the way that's going to come, it's morning by morning, day by day, all the way through the night. And he says, in the very mention, the hearing of the report of what's going to take place is going to be enough to vex you. Just hearing about it can cause fear and anxiety to come upon you. And he says in 20, for the bed is shorter than that a man can stretch himself on it, and the covering narrower than he can wrap himself in it. And things will be super uncomfortable for him. I know if you've ever tried to sleep in a bed that's too short for you, I've done it a few times. It's not very comfortable. You can't stretch out, and I like to stretch out. I don't like having footboards on my beds, because a normal-sized bed, whenever I stretch out the way I want to, my feet will hang out. So I don't want anything there to stop them. And I'm sure all of you, for sure, even if you haven't experienced a bed that's too short, have experienced a blanket that's not big enough, or a spouse that took over half the blanket. It's not wide enough to cover you anymore. Well, that's not very comfortable either. And he says in 21, for the Lord shall rise up as in Mount Perazim. He shall be wroth as in the valley of Gibeon, that he may do his work, his strange work, and bring to pass his act, his strange act. If we look over in 2 Samuel 5 and 20, 2 Samuel 5 and 20, I have here an account of this Mount Perazim. 2 Samuel 5 and 20. It says, and David came to Perazim, and David smote them there, and said, the Lord hath broken forth upon mine enemies before me as the breach of waters. Therefore he called the name of that place Berapazim. If you look just the previous verses, it mentions that the people that he was going up against were the Philistines. It describes this battle that is taking place as the Mount of Breaches. This is what David calls it, and basically it was so easy for him coming through that as if there was no resistance. You know, a wall that has many breaches in it, what good does it do? How easy is it for the enemy to come across? And this is what God says it's going to be like for Judah. He says it's going to be like that, except things are going to be swapped. You're going to be the one with the breaches, not your enemy. You're going to be the one overcome. You're going to be the one that has all of my power against you, not your enemy. Before they had a decisive victory, now they will have a decisive loss. Now, to finish out the chapter, the last few verses 22 through 29, we have an example that is given to us here using a farmer. He says in verse 22, now therefore be ye not mockers, lest your bands be made strong. For I have heard from the Lord God of hosts a consumption even determined upon the whole earth. And then 23, he says, give ye ear and hear my voice. Hearken and hear my speech. It says, you've heard these things, and the Lord's talking to you. So listen now. You've got your chance. You've got your opportunity. Take this seriously. He says in verse 24, "Doth the plowman plow all day to sow? Doth he open and break the clods of his ground? When he hath made plain the face thereof, doth he not cast abroad the fitches, and scatter the cummin, and cast the principal wheat, and the appointed barley, and the rye of their place?" Whenever a farmer is plowing the field, he digs up the ground, breaks up the clods of dirt, and prepares the field to accept the seed, but it is what would look to be very damaging to the field. Having to dig it all up and to break it all apart. And God says, this is what I'm doing. I'm preparing the seed. We're tearing up the ground. We're breaking up the clods with this. It's what I'm doing to prepare for the different seeds that need to be planted to be fruitful. Now, if you have a hard ground and you don't break it up, you won't get much to grow in it. You've got to do it. He even says in 26, he says, "For his God doth instruct him to discretion and doth teach him." This is the way that God has said this is the way it has to be done. And he continues, he gives another example in 27. He says, "For the fitches are not threshed with a threshing instrument, neither is a cartwheel turned upon the cummin, but the fitches are beaten out with a staff, and the cummin with a rod. Bread corn is bruised, because he will not ever be threshing it, nor break it with the wheel of his cart, nor bruise it with his horsemen." He says, and so he describes here, he says that with certain seeds, you don't thresh them like you do others, because their shells break easier. And if you hit them too hard, if you do it too rough, you'll break the seed itself. And there are certain, even today with the large combines that we use, with certain feeds, they still have to be very careful to make sure that they aren't treating certain seeds too roughly, or it'll break them. But there are some that are harder to break, and so you hit them harder. You use the threshing machine, because it requires more work. And so this is what he says in verse 29. He says, "This also cometh forth from the Lord of hosts, which is a wonderful in counsel, and excellent in working." Isaiah says, this is what the Lord is doing. Before, you used to be threshed pretty easily. You used to be able to be broken apart, to be used easily. But now you've got such a hard outside that I've got to hit you hard. I've got to beat you up to get out what I need. So this is what I'm doing. And he says, which is wonderful in counsel and excellent in working. The Lord does everything exactly the way it needs to be done. He says, and this is what the Lord is doing. Exactly what has to be done to get the job done. And it's a warning. Take the easy way. Listen at the beginning. Because the Lord still wins. The Lord still gets what He needs. Sometimes we're ignoring the still small voice of the Holy Spirit, so God beats us upside with a 2x4. And this is what Judah was getting. Instead of being able to look at Israel and go, wow, that's what God did to them, we need to get our act together and listen to Him. So they got the same thing. It's our decision to make. Trust the Lord, follow the Lord, and you'll be blessed. Reject Him, and all we'll get is His judgment. Do we have any